Hello，大家好，又係我高 B 哥啊！係時間提醒大家飲水啦，增添智慧，增添水分，智慧如水啊！好啦，嚟到錄片時間，2025年嘅7月20號啊！高 B 哥咧今日同大家咧分享條影片，一陣間咧喺尾段嗰度就會放出嚟嘅。咁咧就係咧新加坡嘅外長嘅維文咧，去到美國嗰啲智庫嗰度咧就做一個訪問。咁啊，其實呢個訪問咧好長㗎吓，咁啊唔係短短而家咧我抽出嚟嗰10零分鐘㗎。咁但係咧我特別抽呢一段同大家分享咧，就因為咧我發覺咧真係咧有個咁樣嘅現象。首先第一樣嘢咧就係咧，大家有冇留意嗱？無論包括咗係馬凱錫啦，包括咗係楊榮文啦，又或者咧而家現任嘅新加坡外長維文咧，佢哋咧好多時候咧去接受呢個咧叫做外國嘅訪問，尤其是係美國一啲嘅訪問，包括咗啲智庫或者啲論壇咧邀請佢哋去咧即係講關於咧從中國嘅嘢，佢哋咧都講得比較咧頭頭是道一啲嘅。咁嗱，當然啦，我自己個人嘅分析就係咁樣。第一樣嘢咧就係即係咧美國咧，因為咧都認為咧新加坡咧係一個咧比較咧即係有實力嘅國家。雖然哪怕丁屎咁大個，但係咧因為啲咁細個國家咧可以咧做到咧咁出色，喺亞洲裏邊咧係數一數二嘅。其實咧係好難㗎，係冇資源啦，冇地方啦，即係個地方咁細啦。所有嘢都係咧好多嘅限制。咁所以咧，佢哋裏邊咧擺到明㗎啦。新加坡就係精英政治，係咪？大部分嘅咧都係精英嚟嘅，即係做呢個咧政治人物咧，好多咧都係咧即係比較出色。咁所以咧，佢哋好中意咧邀請咧新加坡嘅外長或者佢哋咧即係專業嘅人士咧，或者叫做咧佢哋嘅政治人物咧，同大家講咧關於咧即係無論可能係中國㗎啦，或者咧東南亞嘅嘢。咁呢個第一樣嘢。咁第二樣嘢當然啦，的而且確包括咗馬凱錫楊榮文維文呢啲人咧，其實咧喺外交圈裏邊咧浸淫咗好耐，咁所以咧本身咧佢哋就識咗好多外交嘅人，又或者咧智庫嘅人，咁人哋咧當然會稱過佢哋啦。如果講出嚟嗰啲嘢都冇水準冇水平嘅，講真都費鬼事邀請你嚟啦，啱唔啱啊？咁所以咧佢哋本來咧就比較真係有水準嘅，咁所以佢先會聽佢講。咁第三咧就係咧。可能咧，佢哋會認為咧，新加坡人咧有一大部分嘅人咧，可能睇落咧都係啲華人嘅面孔嗬。咁所以咧，佢哋認為咧，雖然佢哋叫做新加坡人，但係咧佢咧可能咧成日都會撈亂嘅。咁其中一個咧就係咧呢個 TikTok 周受資大家記得去嗬。咁去到咧美國國會去做聽證會啦，咁不停咁問佢你有冇中國嘅護照啊？你係咪喺中國生活好耐？你同中國有咩關係啊？咁所有嘢其實咧。佢哋咧識啲唔識啲啦，就係話咧，喂，我係新加坡人嚟㗎，我揸新加坡護照㗎，我喺新加坡裏邊當過兵添㗎。如果我係中國人，點會做到呢啲嘢啊？咁樣成咁但係咧，即係唔知點解故意特登問啦，可能就挑剔佢啦，又或者咧就係根本佢真係咧搞唔清楚，即係好多人咧即係真心㗎。我哋咧有陣時見到外國人咧，你都未必識得分咧，就話一下子就望到話呢個叫美國人啦，定係英國人啦，定係咧歐洲人啦，定係點樣㗎？咁喺外國人嘅眼中咧，即係新加坡人啦、馬來西亞人啦，跟住咧中國人啦、中國香港人啦、中國台灣人啦、中國澳門人咧，其實咧佢哋全部都唔識分㗎，甚至乎咧佢會咧將日本人啦、韓國人咧都當為係中國人咁樣去分辨㗎。佢哋真係唔識分，佢哋真心唔識分嘅。OK， 佢唔係故意唔係咩種族歧視所有成咁所以係真心唔識分。咁變咗咧，佢唔知唔係誤會咗新加坡咧都係咧即係中國嘅一個省嚟嘅。你唔好笑我真係有一啲咧美國嘅議員咧，真係咁樣認為㗎。你真係唔好以為佢好高水平啊！我已經講咗好多次，呢個民主選舉裏邊咧，其中一個咧敗筆就係咩咧？就係咧咩人都可以走去選舉。其實有啲人咧，本來呢個水平咧真係唔係好高㗎咋。甚至乎咧難聽啲講就算美國有好多咧水平比較高嘅，即係喺呢個美國裏邊咧比較有成就嘅，又或者唔知咩大學畢業碩士甚至乎博士咧，佢哋嘅地理咧都未必係真係咧好叻嘅。所以咧唔識分都唔出奇。真係咧搞笑但係無論如何啦，佢咧今次咧邀請咗咧呢個新加坡嘅外長榮文咧，真係咧做一個咧就係好似訪談咁樣嘅。 咁啊嗱，見佢哋咧喺訪談嗰個過程裏邊咧，關係都唔太差嘅，坦白講。咁咧，但係咧有一啲嘅台下嘅觀眾咧問啲問題咧，就當然咧都係衝住中國嚟噶。咁啊，今次咧我好明顯見到咧，阿維文啊，新加坡呢個外長咧，佢用咗一種態度咧，就係一種好謙虛嘅態度。OK 嗱，可能佢都知道噶啦，同美國人講嘢咧，佢哋一不嬲咧，即係呢個咧個鼻啊同埋隻眼咧，唔知生咗個頭殼頂嗰度噶嘛有一種好自傲、好驕傲嗰種心態同佢做。咁但係咧講到尾，人哋都係一個國家嘅外長，你又唔能夠咧就唔尊重人哋。再加埋咧，佢一聽同佢講兩句説話，人哋講啲嘢有冇水準、有冇水平咧？其實咧咁台下啲人都聽得出嘅。咁如果你真係好有水準、好有水平嘅，咁佢即係雖然咧就用一啲比較衝或者挑剔嘅問題去問你，但係咧佢又唔會話咧即係咧即係潑婦罵街啊，又或者咧就好低俗咁啊，好似用鬧啊咁樣嘅形式咧去講嘢。咁所以咧相對嚟講嘅氣氛咧都叫做和諧同融洽嘅。咁啊問到咧關於咧即係中國嘅嘢嘅時候咧，阿維文咧就解釋翻俾佢聽，作為一個咧咁細笪嘅地方一個咧細個咧好似咧只係一個咧小國家，喺佢哋嘅角度咧係點樣睇呢件事？咁啊引經據典之餘咧，就好多時候咧都係咧提醒翻咧，即係美國嘅人美國嘅呢啲智庫啊，或者啲政治人物都係講呢一樣嘢。而呢樣嘢咧，佢哋咧永遠都冇得駁㗎就係話咧，你睇呢啲事咧，你要由歷史嘅角度嚟睇㗎。因為咧中國係一個咧5000年文化、5000年文明嘅國家嚟㗎，所以咧有好多嘢咧，佢哋咧係用一個歷史作為一個參考。既然咧中國都話晒俾你哋聽，佢哋係用咁樣嘅方法咧嚟到咧睇事情嘅話咧，你一定要咧就係了解係咪知己知彼啊嘛？你唔可以永遠都從你自己美國或者西方人嘅角度咧去睇事情嘅，所以咧知己知彼係好重要嘅。咁亦都講到咧就係話咧，中國而家喺呢個南海喺呢個其他地方咧，就有一個擴張主義嘅所謂擴張主義，咁認為我哋美國點樣去處理咁樣成。咁即係美國人咧，尤其是而家問問題嗰個冇人知佢係邊個嚟咁但係咧就聽落咧係啲即係政府官員或者智庫咁樣嘅人啦。咁佢就問呢個問題，咁其實好特別嘅東南亞就係東南亞。咁美國咧我慣咗以為咧成個世界都係佢哋管轄嘅。咁所以咧喺東南亞咧佢有佢嘅利益，所以咧佢一定要咧就禁止咧中國咧做一個所謂擴張主義，喺佢哋嘅眼中係擴張主義。咁但係咧阿維文咧就答咗佢咧一樣嘢，佢話首先咧你咧就從呢個即係暗示明示都好啦，就從西方嘅角度去睇。佢話我又試下同你講東南亞嘅角度咁樣話。究竟東南亞個角度點樣睇呢件事咧？咁留翻咧影片同大家講，就唔好我講俾大家聽啦。至於咧究竟應該點樣同咧中國處理其他嘅事務咧？佢咧都係頭是道去解釋俾佢哋聽。最重要係咩咧？最重要咧，佢唔係用一種方法論同佢講，即係話嗱，如果你咁樣處理嘅話，你要用呢一個方法去處理。你咁如果咁樣做咧，你要用嗰一個方法去處理。因為呢啲咧，去到咁高階嘅人嘅時候咧，佢哋好多時候咧都唔中意聽方法論啫。點啊？你教我做嘢你教我用呢個方法咁如果我唔係用呢個方法，係咪真係做唔到先？所以咧好多時候咧，去到咧咁高階嘅時候咧，就唔係用方法論嘅，就唔係好似我哋啲平民百姓咁最緊要問個方法翻嚟跟住咧跟你個方法處理，做到咧就非常開心，做唔到咧就鬧你，有冇搞錯都唔得嘅，呢個方法唔 work 咁樣。呢啲咧就即係比較咧基層少少佢哋嘅做法咧就係咧去解釋俾你聽咧，整個大嘅背景係點樣。所以咧，如果你想做到點樣嘅時候咧，你應該要點做，或者你話你想做到嗰條線喺邊度先？其中提咗一樣嘢咧就好簡單，佢就話，好似歐洲咁樣你哋咧又做咗好多呢華沙公約或者其他嗰個事情，又話咧就將點樣將呢個俄羅斯去融入呢個歐洲。但係咧，你哋咧從來都冇話過。佢話 Where is the line 佢話你條線喺邊度？呢條紅線喺邊度？究竟你哋想做乜？你哋自己知唔知做乜？呢啲所有嘅嘢咧，你如果唔搞清楚嘅話咧，基本上咧根本就做唔到。就同處理中國咧個所謂叫做擴張論一樣。你哋想做乜先？你哋點做先？係咪？你哋要達到咩嘅目的先？如果你哋自己都唔清楚，人哋根本處理唔到㗎。好啦，留翻俾佢同大家講下。
We'll have to see what happens now. And obviously, the real big contest in the room is actually China and the US, right? And well, I've been in Washington a month ago. 2 months ago, I was in Beijing a month ago. Actually, let me let you in on not really a secret, but the Chinese are in a confident mood. Why? Because number one, you see, look, this trade tensions just turbocharges our efforts at self-reliance. It is a spur to our people that you can't be complacent, you can't take the world for granted, and we need to speed up this journey for self-reliance. So making virtue out of a necessity. Number two, and I think that's become clear even to the US now, China has leverage. Take rare earths, critical minerals, for instance. So it's not as if your counterparty has no agency. And third, China has a much higher threshold for pain than others. And whatever the criticisms you may have on political systems, China has a system which is capable of a long-term outlook. So it's in a state of confidence. Now, that does not mean that China actually wants to wreck the global trading system, because I mentioned Singapore as a beneficiary of Pax Americana and the other Asian tigers, but actually the biggest beneficiary of the last 80 years has been China, especially after reform and opening. So China is not a revanchist power from an economic perspective. So they would still much prefer a modus vivendi with America, and that does require respectful, candid, constructive conversation in the room.
I want to come back to China specifically in a minute, but before that, I'm going to do something very unfair. I'm going to ask you something that your former boss, Lee Kuan Yew's son, Prime Minister Lee, said in 2018.
Yes.
I think at the Shangri-La Dialogue, if I'm not mistaken. He said it would be better or desirable if ASEAN countries did not have to choose between the US and China, but the day may come when it has to. So my question is, are we closer to that day?
Let me give you a Southeast Asian view. When we look at Europe, and I know there was discussion of the war in Ukraine just now, it seems to me, and Nick can correct me, that the fundamental strategic question in Europe is, where is that line? The Iron Curtain, the Warsaw Pact, the eastward expansion of NATO. Where is Ukraine? And where does Russia fit into Europe? And unfortunately, that question still results in ongoing bloodshed. In Southeast Asia, we don't want to be trapped in that same paradigm of where is that line. The preferred strategic model for all of us in Southeast Asia is to make sure that the two superpowers, the United States and China, and the middle powers, including India, Australia, the Middle East, have skin in the game and have a stake in our continued peace and prosperity, and that we do not want Southeast Asia to become again an arena for proxy wars. So can you see we are on a completely different, operating on a completely different paradigm. What my former Prime Minister said, in Southeast Asia, we believe in overlapping circles of friends, which means your circle may be different from mine, but they're overlapping circles. And we truly believe in win-win arrangements. We are champions at negotiating free trade agreements. I mean, from a Singapore perspective, over 90% of my trade is covered in some free trade agreement or the other. We are strong proponents of the WTO. We engage in multilateral, plurilateral arrangements, but we still make all these stepping stones to ultimately a free trade area for the world. Right? So it's a completely different paradigm. So do you want to be forced to choose sides? Of course we don't. That goes against our organizing principle. But having said that, we don't control the agenda in Beijing and Washington. What I can say from direct experience over a decade is that so far, both sides reassure us we're not forcing you to choose sides. Now, I will take that at face value, but it is a delicate balancing act.
But do you feel like it's becoming harder to do that delicate balancing act?
It will become, let's put it this way, in a period where you've reached an end of an era and the rules are no longer underwritten, and any student of history will know the most dangerous phase is the interregnum between one world order and an inchoate new world order. Are we in that interregnum? Yes, we are. Are we witnessing hot wars in Europe, hot wars in the Middle East? Yes, we are. Are we anxious about potential rising tensions in the Pacific, in the South China Sea, in the Straits? Yes, we are. So I am concerned, and on a macro level, that this is a very dangerous time geopolitically. This is a very unconducive time for trade because of the profound damage to an architecture which has served us well for 80 years. And I may add, the United Nations and the Security Council is essentially paralyzed. So there are enough reasons for amber lights to be going off. And it's not just because of Washington and Beijing. I'm trying to take a broader and longer view of what's happening in the world.
You may believe that conflict is not inevitable, but what seems to be the reality is an expansionist Chinese policy throughout Southeast Asia, whether it's military, economic, or diplomatic. For the last decade or so, the U.S. has prioritized things like minilaterals or constellations around the region to try and get at that, including, or in addition to increasing security in the Pacific. So what do you believe is the best way to respond to Beijing's expansionist policy? Thanks.
I used, every year, I used to pay my respects to Henry Kissinger in his office, right up to the final year. And the point he kept reminding me was that a war between China and the US must never be fought because the consequences are just too catastrophic. And I think even now, Henry's admonition and reminder to all of us is worth bearing in mind. So if you start with that as the first line, then next is to understand the domestic politics and self-image of both China and the US. China is a 5,000-year civilization. And the reason we are both speaking English today is because the Industrial Revolution began in England and then went across to Europe. And the ultimate beneficiary, or the ultimate heir of the Industrial Revolution was the United States of America. The last time China had a maritime fleet, you've got to go back to the Ming Dynasty, 1403 or so, Admiral Zheng He and the rest of it. And then China decided they would stop these fleets. There was a waste of money. Anyway, China had reached the zenith of civilization. There was nothing the barbarians could teach. And China paid a very heavy price for turning inwards. And Europe and America won. And what the Chinese remember most now is, if you really want to trigger a Chinese diplomat, talk about unequal treaties. I think Nick is familiar with it. Do you agree? That's, if you want to press a button, unequal treaties. And China is not short of treaties in the last 2 centuries which were highly unequal, including some with its greatest peril today. Let's not get into it. Right? The point is that if you look over millennia, every time China was at peace and intact and running a continental-sized economy, it constituted about 25 to 30% of global GDP. But the trouble is, if you look across 2 to 5 millennia, the United States was not there. The United States is, 249 years? Thereabouts. So what you have now is 2 superpowers with no historical memory of ever having to engage with one another. Do you see that? So we are truly in uncharted waters. Having said that, we have to all hope and pray that these 2 giants work something out. Because war is not, inevitable, right? And you can sit down and focus on the future and focus on getting your domestic house in order. And frankly, both China and the US have got a lot of domestic homework to focus on. And for the rest of us, do the same. Check our domestic situation and check our fitness for the future. Try to make common cause. And when the 2 big boys have sorted their modus vivendi, try to plug them in and make sure they have a stake in our survival, our prosperity, and our stability. And that's why maybe it's just I've been in this post for too long, but diplomats have to be somewhat optimistic. Otherwise, you can't get up and go to work every day. So anyway, I hope you accept my thesis. Coming from a tiny island city-state, dependent on the world, but having to take the world as it is, but still have enough hope and vision that there is a better tomorrow.